Thank you, Mike. Images are very powerful. They can pull us into connecting with our own memories and all of the feelings associated with those experiences as well. And perhaps some of those pictures may have recalled experiences which are personal, connected with your own family and friends, relations, or people that you have served and worked closely with and walked alongside during this whole COVID period. When I was in the seminary some 30 years ago, it was customary for those about to be ordained to receive their appointment a few months before ordination. We were a missionary community, which meant that appointments would frequently send us to far-flung parts of the globe. East, West, or South Africa, South America, South Asia or Southeast Asia, the Middle East, or perhaps occasionally a little nearer to home. Wherever you were appointed meant a good deal of old-fashioned research. This was long before Google. New territory meant new customs, new cultures, new languages, different political systems, climate variations which could range from oppressive humidity and heat to cold and cooler climes. There was a lot to prepare for. How developed would the place be? Would there be electricity, water, communications, even tarmac on the roads or dirt tracks? Was healthcare accessible should we become ill? Would we be welcomed by the local people, or was it an environment less welcoming to missionaries? What kind of illnesses were common to these far-flung lands? What would we need to read up on? Do we have friends already working there? What were the social economic conditions? And what, indeed, would our pastoral priorities be? I still recall sitting in a group after Mass enjoying a beer one Saturday evening in the college with some of my colleagues who had just received their appointments. And appointment time was a mixture of excitement and anxiety about the unknown. Most appointment destinations were familiar to us, even if it was just a name and a dot on the world map. Asked where he would be going, I still recall one colleague saying, "I've been appointed to work with the Halawi people." This was news to us, and after a moment of digesting the information, another colleague asked, "Oh, and where are they?" And with a glint in his Liverpool eye, he responded, "Well, they are 4-foot-tall pygmies who live in 6-foot-tall elephant grass, and they jump up and down all day shouting, 'Where the Halawi? Where the Halawi?'" Beyond the humour, there is probably something quite serious and familiar to us about this story. COVID has arguably been like an unexpected appointment to an unexpected destination. A place where none of us knew the lie of the land, or the climate, the customs, or the language. There were no maps and nobody there to guide us who had been there before and worked their way through this. There was no wisdom to impart, and no reservoir of tried and tested ways to reach out, to be alongside colleagues, patients, and staff. We indeed were the pygmies, living in thick, mysterious COVID elephant grass, jumping up and down inside ourselves, asking, where the hell are we? Today, I want to reflect with you on being that hospice chaplain 2 years down the line. Taking the opportunity to pause and reconnect with our sense of identity and mission. While there are a number of sources that we could talk about that contribute to our sense of identity and mission as hospice chaplains, including most obviously the church, the NHS, the arrival of the agenda for change, and the absorption of chaplaincy into a dominant medical narrative and culture where professionalism, accountability, structures, and task orientation became strong identifiers. Our goal today is not to unpick the enormously complex journey, but rather to pause and think about how the COVID-19 experience, so fresh in our minds and memories, has interrupted the mood music of palliative care chaplaincy, inviting us to re-examine our maps, our mission, and the way in which we identify ourselves, and indeed the way we are identified by others. So then, why do we say that the mood music of palliative care chaplaincy has been interrupted? What has changed? As I speak, I'm very conscious here of the danger of launching out into overgeneralizations, when perhaps one of the most identifiable realities of hospice care in the UK is the sheer volume of variation. So many hospices in the UK are charities which are relatively small and local, with a few well-known exceptions, of course. Charities which take pride in making a local impact, building strong relations and a sense of ownership with the local community. Some hospices have day centres and outpatient services, as well as inpatient units. Some take pride in making these services a core part of their offer. Some hospices will pay attention to cultivating non-medical elements of their offer, including art therapy, music therapy, writing groups, reminiscence groups, carers groups, individual and group bereavement support, men's groups, walk and talk groups, coffee groups, complementary therapy services, and so on and so forth. Others take a more conservative position when it comes to these things, preferring to focus on the development of supplementary clinics, checkups, or clinical education opportunities. So then, given such a wide variety, what gives us the confidence to say that there is indeed evidence that the mood music has changed? While there are many indicators of change that have begun to emerge, I'm going to limit myself today to mentioning 4 of them. They may not even prove to be the 4 most significant areas of change, or where change is needed, and I'm looking forward to working with you later this week in terms of uncovering more in our group discussions. They are, however, areas that stand out to me from my own position in the trenches as a hospice chaplain, and as a reflective practitioner trying to make sense of how and why the field of my work seems to have changed. I want to look at 4 different movements. From lack of clarity to effective leadership. From traditional to creative means of connecting. From sideline to center stage. And from walking with patients and family to walking with staff. The first movement is related to effective leadership. You might recall the results of the international survey we also looked at last year of what chaplains did during COVID-19, led by Professor Austin Snowden of Edinburgh Napier University, which emerged last year. With over 1,600 respondents globally and around half of those from Europe and the UK, one of the core findings of the survey, which was repeated earlier this year by Professor Snowden at a World Health Organization event on palliative care chaplaincy, was that local leadership consistently proved to be key to how well hospices use their chaplaincy resources. At the same World Health Organization event, Snowden endorsed the Sinclair and Chochinov 2012 model of palliative care, which validates the chaplain as an equal specialist member of the professional hospice team, along with medical, social, and psychological specialists. Even as a non-religious person, Snowden recalled with respect and gratitude the support he received from a chaplain when his own mother was dying 10 years ago. For Snowden, there is no doubt about the place and value of chaplaincy at end of life. But there again, the lived experience of many chaplains on the ground is one of confusion and uncertainty. What do their organizations expect of them? Conversations with a number of hospice chaplains over the last 2 years, and even in this room today for that matter, reveals a degree of flux. Some hospice leadership teams remain unsure as to how best to make sense of and best to deploy their chaplains. Some hospices use their chaplains extremely well, contributing significantly to the pastoral care and support of patients, especially significant when COVID regulations meant that visitor access was stopped. While this in itself felt like an affront to the very raison d'etre of hospices, moral injury, some chaplains reported being able to liaise between family members and the patient, at times assisting in smoothing the tension that understandably arose between staff and family members. Why on earth wouldn't it? Rules seemed draconian, with family prevented from seeing mum or dad, aunt or uncle, for fear of inadvertently passing on the virus, a virus we knew too little about. And then there was the stage of allowing one visitor to be present. My heart went out to these visitors as well as the patients. The terrible responsibility of being the family member to pass on collective goodbyes, when we understood instinctively and relationally that the patient needed more than that. And if the patient were to take a turn for the worst, the prospect that they may be the only one present with little support for themselves and then the responsibility of making phone calls to other family members to inform them of the news. Moral injury seems an appropriate term on one level, but in another it doesn't quite suffice to sum up the whirl of emotions that accompanied this family member. And staff too. So many of them were deeply upset that they were unable to reach out in the way that they were used to, unable to show their faces from behind the safety of their N95 masks and face shields, unable to touch and hold hands with anxious patients as they were used to. And where leadership saw and understood this, chaplains became an important presence, being alongside the lone family member, and also being alongside staff as they tried to work through this. And then there were other hospice leadership teams who were less sure how to use their chaplaincy resources. Citing NHS concerns, some hospices furloughed their chaplains or sent them home to work remotely. But how do you work remotely when the core of what you do, being alongside, is fundamentally relational? How do you connect with patients and family members? How do you support colleagues? This brings me to the second of our four movements, from traditional to creative means of connecting. My hospice at that time opted to instruct me to work from home until further notice. I had little over 24 hours notice to make sure that I had all that I would need to continue my role remotely. With a team of around a dozen active spiritual care and chaplaincy volunteers to inform, this was a big ask. Some of the team were quite calm and philosophical about it, imagining that this was a knee-jerk reaction fueled by insufficient information about the virus and how it was passed on and how best to manage it. Others felt a sense of relief as they had some underlying health conditions, which meant that it was better for their own safety and the safety of their loved ones not to come into the hospice. There was no business continuity plan scenario for this one. There had been no desktop exercise to anticipate the management of this kind of scenario. I went home with my laptop computer, a decked phone to plug into my home router, and little else. To be fair, this was hardly an exclusive experience of hospice chaplains. My wife worked at a children's centre, and she too suddenly found herself working from home. So Monday to Friday, from 9 a.m. to around 6 p.m, our box room and our spare bedroom became busy satellites of the hospice and the Hemel Hempstead Children's Centre. How our Wi-Fi and telephone system coped with the level of traffic over the next several months, I will never know. A month before being told to work at home, if you had asked me what Zoom was, I would probably have offered two possible answers. Firstly, a nice lolly I can remember from my childhood. A few nods around the room there. And secondly, something that the technicians at NASA work on. But needs must, and I felt a degree of triumph having been able to coax our most hardened technophobe team member into getting online in our very first ever chaplaincy Zoom meeting. The fact that I needed to call him every 15 minutes or so to explain about switching his microphone on and off at the appropriate moment is neither here nor there. It was pretty much a success. We were all there. The team agreed to continue to be available for patients as best they could via telephone, FaceTime, Zoom, WhatsApp, and so on and so forth. This was completely new to them, but it was also a new one on patients, family members and staff. Staff were not quite sure how to explain this new means of availability as patients came in. Over the coming weeks and months, I was surprised at the level of progress that we made. From little or no serious resources, over the coming weeks and months, we managed to set up, please do forgive me if this sounds like bragging, I was just trying to write down a list of stuff that we managed to achieve. A telephone and online pastoral support training program for volunteer chaplains delivered online. A telephone and online pastoral support system for patients both on the IPU and at home in the community. Prayer pods, you can ask me about that later. A resource section on spiritual and pastoral care for the hospice website, including guides to mindfulness, anxiety management, self-care, religious guidance following a death, guides for a funeral service from home where you can't attend in person, prayer guides, retreat resources, links to streamed services for local churches, mosques and synagogues, a creative writing group, a coffee and mingle Zoom session, memorial services online, bereavement support by telephone and online, lunch and learn groups for staff, which is a Zoom drop-in session where staff could ask chaplains anything they wanted as they enjoyed their soup, salad or sandwich. Christmas carols online, Hanukkah online, which brought in people from as far afield as Israel, Germany and the US, as well as local people. Light Up a Life online. Check-in and support slots for staff and volunteers. Clinical supervision online. Pastoral reflection online. This was not, of course, all me. So much creativity emerged from within the team, and I must give a shout out here to young Rabbi Aaron, who kind of became my social media guru. Chaplains found themselves in a completely new landscape, where new ways of enabling human contact had to be sought out and applied. Dinosaurs like myself were forced into a crash course on social media and the virtual world. For myself, this was an entirely new experience. As a psychotherapist as well as a chaplain, I was instinctively wary of anything which would remove visual cues and data, handicapping me in my preferred way of engaging with people, which was always face-to-face. Even Zoom did not offer total comfort, as it still did not allow me to read the nuances of body language as I was used to. But pastoral needs would not evaporate under COVID, and chaplains explored new ways of connecting, new ways of reaching out, new ways of being alongside. I want to turn now to our third movement, which is from sideline to centre stage. Two things appeared to be happening at this point. There was an existential shift within healthcare, with unprecedented levels of demand and need. We were asked to protect the NHS. We all saw the pictures of Nightingale hospitals being hastily erected in different parts of the country. The confidence of the health system was knocked, and it was exposed to its limits and vulnerabilities. On the front line of exposure to the virus, some staff became ill, with others sadly even losing their lives. Even when staff did not become ill or worse, the internalized sense of vulnerability became very evident. Fear of exposure to the virus sparked a spike in psychological distress among frontline staff. Absences increased and staffing emergencies intensified. The volume of staff taking time off because of stress increased significantly and was not softened by the weekly clap for the NHS. One strong message emerging from chaplains was the significant increase in need for staff support. In the last year alone, official statistics tell us that over 27,000 doctors and nurses have left or are planning to leave the NHS. Many citing the experience of stress and unrelenting patient need. Many have cited their desire to retire from the increasing demand, taking time to look after themselves and their families. So many of the chaplains I spoke to speak of the enormous increase in focus on staff. Even when it came to selling my home in Hemel Hempstead last July, it was interesting to hear the estate agent say that the big selling points on a home used to be the kitchen and bathroom. Now it's the garden. Having been forced to stay at home, many people, including NHS staff, began to reimagine their lives and seek change. Many chaplains have reported over the years a sense of becoming peripheral to the dominant medical narrative, to the extent that within healthcare, to partially justify a continued presence, we have had to develop and modify hybrid means of demonstrating accountability. What I mean here is simply this: most roles within healthcare are task-oriented roles. We demonstrate accountability through the completion of a task which is logged on the system, can be viewed by others, and is then added to the data. For chaplains, however, this model becomes a little more tricky. The core of what we do is relational, exploring ways of being alongside patients and family members, gradually building trust as we wait to be invited into the landscape of their inner world. The extent to which this happens ultimately decides how useful and meaningful chaplaincy support becomes for the individual patient or family member. Systems of accountability are more commonly designed to harvest quantitative rather than qualitative data, which can at times mean that chaplaincy effectiveness is logged under number of visits, length of visits, communion received, patient anointed, funeral planned, funerals taken, and so on and so forth. Please don't get me wrong, all of these things have value and importance, but they don't necessarily grasp the subjective and qualitative impact of chaplaincy at the cutting edge. This is not always understood by management, who themselves may be under pressure to demonstrate quantity above the quality of being alongside people. But something else is changing here. How many of us have repeatedly heard medical and nursing colleagues grieve the loss of relationship in what they do? How many times have we heard colleagues talk of not having time to connect with patients and family members? There is a dissatisfaction with the task-focused model, the rise of terms in recent years such as person-centered care. This is not new to chaplains, especially at end of life. Our role has to be person-centered, otherwise we fail. The existential crisis of COVID has also ushered in a deeper realization of the inner world of human beings. It has become more difficult to muffle our inner discontent, and people are beginning to look for change. We hear of unprecedented numbers on waiting lists for counselling or CBT or other forms of psychological support. The last I checked, there were something like 1.6 million people waiting for CBT alone. Chaplains report a growing awareness of their role, with several high-profile reports on chaplaincy work, both in the press and media. In one particular publication, chaplains were described as, quote, the women and men who run towards the dying. We have seen evidence of a shift in chaplaincy, moving from background to foreground. Perhaps not dramatically, but evidence nonetheless. As pictures emerged in the media of chaplains praying for the dying patients with their hands against the door. The shift is evident, but still has a long way to go. Thinking of chaplaincy as a peripheral contributor to patient care, and particularly to end-of-life care, requires a significant unlearning of biases. To really grasp a meaningful perception of the identity and mission of chaplains will require a letting go of some stubborn and widely held assumptions or biases about chaplaincy. This in itself could warrant an entire session for our conference, but suffice to say that one common candidate for unlearning is the binary language of religious and not religious. As recently as a matter of days ago, attending an MDT who is showing multiple indicators of total pain. But the reason that they weren't referred to chaplaincy was because, oh, she's not religious. I think one or two of us might have heard that before. Perhaps because of my psychological as well as theological training, I find myself more and more passionate about seeking out and using a language for spiritual and pastoral care that bypasses the binary bias. I practice that. I'm okay. The words spiritual, faith, and religious may become obstacles to some patients because of their theological root. But when we revisit the etymology of these words, we find that spirituality finds its roots in the Latin word spiritus, which means breath. Faith comes from the Latin fidere, which means to trust, and religion from the Latin religare, which means to bind unto or be part of. Suddenly, we have a language which moves from what's your spirituality, what's your faith, and what's your religion, to what breathes life and meaning into you. What gives you a sense of connectedness to the world, to others, and to yourself? What or who do you trust the most? What or who do you feel most connected to? We then end up opening up these questions to people of all faiths or none, placing no condition or expectation on the reason for us being alongside. We turn now to the fourth and final movement, from walking with patients and family to walking with staff. I suspect that even this title is a little bit wobbly, especially if it implies that walking with patients and families is somehow lessened as we move on to walking with staff. This is not the intention. The focus on patient and family support remains just as strong. Many hospice chaplains I've spoken to over the last 2 years have commented on their own experience of being more noticed by staff. While, again, I'm conscious of the perils of overgeneralizing, these conversations have happened frequently enough for me to say with reasonable confidence that more staff are engaging with chaplaincy for pastoral and emotional support, bringing questions about their own meaning, purpose, and identity. COVID has ushered in a wave of thirst for the inner world, with many people struggling to find a language that adequately puts words onto their sense of feeling unsettled, of exploring and seeking something deeper. CBT will, of course, provide something to some of those who ask for it, but I suspect that the standard 6 to 8 sessions may not be sufficient to address what's going on internally. I myself have had 2 more members of staff signing up for supervision with me in the last week. These aren't people who would describe themselves as mainstream religious or even peripherally religious. The thirst to converse pushes them over the line of any concerns that the chaplain just might have a proselytizing agenda going on, even when they swear blind that they haven't. There's a bit of a dance that takes place in this regard. Excuse me. How many of us have had conversations with colleagues that begin something like this? Well, of course, I'm not religious myself, but ... It's often the of course part that causes me to stifle a smile. It's another one of those unlearning opportunities emerging. I'm going to get a drink of water. Excuse me. I brought my own mug. That's good gin. Okay. The assumption that for a person to be religious, somehow they can no longer adhere to logical thinking processes and that it might be offensive to us as religious people to imagine that science is incompatible with faith. Another assumption. In my 20 plus years as a missionary, one of the things that became a mantra to us was the importance of learning the language of the people you serve. I found this striking as I reflected with my own pastoral supervisor. It was uncomfortable to realize that it was not just the others who had to do the unlearning. I do too. Perhaps part of the process of reclaiming my sense of identity and mission as a chaplain was to let go of any internalized sense of victim within myself. By that, I hastily add that I can suggest nothing about the internal processes of other chaplains, but looking at my own self in the mirror, I recognize that part of myself is resigned to a background role, supporting the more heroic and socially recognized roles of hospice, doctor, and nurse. Part of my mission and identity is to reclaim my role as teacher and questioner, as well as companion and listener. We give witness to the inner movements of patients, family members, and staff. Interesting to recall that the Greek word for witness is marturion, from which we get the English word martyr. Educating others is an integral part of our identity and mission because education empowers others. But this process will always meet with some degree of resistance, and perhaps, even for us, some degree of suffering. I don't see evidence of a resurgence or in organised religious affiliation amongst hospice staff, but I do see evidence of the inner questioning that awakens people to exploring their own meaning, purpose, and identity. In recent months, the UK has been recruiting nurses and medical staff abroad, bringing in some 23,000 new recruits, with the largest groups being from India and the Philippines. This is just to cover the gap exposed by the even larger number leaving the NHS. Perhaps a key part of our mission as hospice chaplains is not only to become people who walk with staff by listening to them, but also becoming inner guides and language teachers. By language teachers, I mean building confidence in staff through access to spiritual care education. We cannot expect them to have spiritual care type conversations with patients and family members, or even with us, when they're not used to, or they don't have the language and means to have these conversations internally. We can't, of course, impose this language or training on them, but I suspect that a well-prepared training opportunity would attract attention. One course title I advertised recently was Becoming Familiar with the Language and Purpose of Spiritual Care. It hasn't happened yet, but let's see how many we get signing up. The last thing I want to share with you, when it makes me think of language and how language can actually separate us rather than unite us if we're not careful, springs from sessions I've been invited to do with trainee GPs who have come into the hospice, but also with registrars and other junior doctors. When I walk into the room with trained GPs, I suspect that the first thing on people's minds is that I'm going to talk to them about the religious dimension of spiritual care. But the first question I ask usually is, what are the two key questions of the modern scientific method? It's usually at this point that I'm met with varying degrees of silence. That's not what we thought you were going to say. That shouldn't be part of your script, surely. But it is an important question. The modern Western scientific method finds its roots in a branch of philosophy known as radical materialism. And radical materialism posits that we can know nothing except that which comes from empirical observation and measurement. And so the two key questions which back this up are what and how. And palliative care exposes us to a broadening range of questions. What is happening to this patient? How do we deal with them? What kind of medication do we need to give them? How do we adjust that medication to make sure that we offer them the best level of care and support? What, how? These questions come up and over and are repeated up and over again and again and again. But palliative care questions that those two questions are enough. What and how? When a patient has just received bad news, what's the first question that usually goes through their mind? Why? Why? Why me? Why should this be happening to me? For a person of faith, why would God allow this to happen to me? My sense is always that a good doctor is a one who understands the modern scientific method and applies it very well. But a better doctor is also somebody who understands the limits of the modern scientific method. And it does have its limits. And perhaps that's where there is room for dialogue between the language of spiritual care and the language of modern medicine. As hospice chaplains, we work with the whys of our patients and family members on a day-to-day basis. In summary, reconnecting with our sense of identity and mission involves not just an external change in perception of who we are and what we do, but an internal rediscovery of our own sense of mission and identity. We become less passive in being described through our role descriptions, and more active in educating others into better, sharper, and more accessible forms of chaplaincy. Colleagues and patients begin to recognize that our starting point is always the sacredness of their story, not a binary label of religious or non-religious. Our mission is to walk alongside people, staff, or patients, accompanying them as they ask questions about identity, meaning, purpose, and legacy. We are rooted in the depths of our own faith, and that faith sustains us as we learn to take care of ourselves and as we care for others. We're always faced with limits in how we can or cannot work, but this is also another human reality that we work with on a daily basis as we walk with others, who in turn try to negotiate their own limits. We seek not to settle into a ready-made role, but to find new and different ways of walking alongside others. even if that has to be virtual walking. Chaplains are dynamic, responsive, passionate, creative, faithful, respectful, and cooperative. I'm going to give the last words to my coffee mug, which I designed last year with my chaplaincy team in London, and I suspect will speak to most of us, if not all of us here. Hospice chaplaincy. 97% non-judgmental listening, hopeful presence, patient and family pastoral support, specialist guidance, expertise in faith traditions and culture, existential crises management, engaging in the here and now, compassionate companionship, empathic confidant, staff support, mediator and accompanying, multi-faith and no-faith flexible. 3% prayer and ritual. 100% respectful and person-centered. Always more than meets the eye. Thank you very much.